Hi everyone, thanks for coming tonight. I talk really fast. I'm going to start with that before I say anything else. If I'm talking too fast, then what I ask you to do is throw things at me. That gets me to slow down. So today I'm going to change the focus of that talk a little bit, and I wasn't the one actually that came up with that catchy title, Not Your Mom's Marijuana. The magistrate in Larimer County came up with the title. I'm not as creative. So my title is Marijuana and the Adolescent Brain, and we're going to talk about a lot of things tonight. I'm going to first start about talking about the way the brain develops and then the impact of substance use on the brain, particularly marijuana use on the brain, and then we'll talk about what current cannabis use looks like, and I'll use cannabis and marijuana fairly interchangeably. They mean basically the same thing. The research field is trying to push to use the word cannabis, but most of us still use the word marijuana, so if I use the word cannabis, I'm talking about the same thing as marijuana in this sense. First, tell you a little bit more about myself. So I graduated from UCLA with a PhD in clinical psychology and a minor in quantitative psychology and a specialization in genetics and genomics. I did a postdoctoral fellowship at the Integrated Substance Abuse Programs where I did a lot of research on the impact of laws on marijuana use, or on substance use more broadly. I was then an assistant professor at Temple University from 2008 to 2012 in the developmental and the clinical areas. I went the wrong way with the button. I knew I'd do that at least 12 times. Currently I'm an associate professor in the counseling psychology program in the Department of Psychology at Colorado State University. I'm also the director of addiction counseling programs. We have an undergraduate concentration in addiction counseling and a master's, two-year terminal master's degree program in addiction counseling. And I'm a licensed psychologist in the state of Colorado. For those of you who don't know what that means I'm a therapist as well. So I do a lot of different things. I primarily teach in the graduate program and do research. My research focuses on the genetic and personality predictors of engagement in health risk behaviors, especially among adolescents. When I talk about health risk behaviors, I'm talking about things like risky sexual behavior, substance use, criminal behavior that leads to incarceration. And my primary goal is to try to help develop intervention and prevention programs that offset the negative outcomes from those behaviors. So incarceration, substance use disorders, unwanted pregnancy, or the transmission of sexually transmitted infections. When we talk about so one of the things I do is imaging genetics. So I try to look at the genetic sequencing and determine if I can hypothesize about and recognize differential brain functioning based on genetic information, and then also look at psychometrics of sensation-seeking, impulsivity, and emotion dysregulation. So those are personality factors that I'm interested in that are much more likely to lead at high levels to engagement in health risk behaviors. I do a lot of cannabis research and am currently funded by the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment to look at vulnerable populations, to look at how the laws in Colorado affect marijuana use among our population, and to try to improve the way we measure marijuana use. We'll talk some more about that as I go through. We do trauma-informed neuropsych evaluations as well, so trying to understand the impact of early childhood trauma on psychological and neuropsychological functioning. So that's just a brief snapshot of what I'm currently working on. And what I'm going to talk to you tonight a lot about is both brain development. We'll talk about the brain, and then we'll talk about the adolescent brain, and then we'll talk about what happens when we use marijuana to our brain. So we think about brain development. Most people think about brain development occurring in utero, so while the baby's still in the womb, or during childhood, but actually your brain continues to develop across the lifespan. And it's important to think about that. We used to think that the brain was fully developed around the age of 18, which is why things like voter laws and smoking didn't become legal until you're 18 years old. We know now that the brain doesn't actually fully develop until about 24 or 25 years of life. At that point, all of us started dying, right? So at 24, 25, our brain's fully formed. Actually, we were dying the whole time, but our brain really starts to die after that. I'll probably come back to that point once or twice too. And the primary processes of brain development are the formation and strengthening of connections and the neural pruning process. So up through about the middle of adolescence, our brain is developing connections. I think maybe some of you have heard that when you're born, you're able to speak any language that's ever been developed, but over time, we lose the ability to produce accents or to make sounds for certain languages we never speak. What our brain does is it goes through a refining process where it starts also to lose connections or do what's called neural pruning, and this process is pretty important. We strengthen connections that we use more frequently, and we dispose of connections that we don't use. So when I talk about brain development, it's those primary processes that I'm talking about. And this pruning process primarily occurs during adolescence and young adulthood, and this will become important as we go through this talk as well. So we look at brain maturation across time, and we look at the amount of the percentage of gray matter in the brain. So when we're young, we have a lot of gray matter, and as we get older, it starts to disappear. I didn't show pictures older than this because I didn't want to get depressed myself. But basically, over time, we see this pruning of materials so that we're only really holding on to connections that our brain uses at a frequent rate. If we're using it over and over again, we maintain the connection, we strengthen the connection. If we're not using it at all, the connection goes away. Any questions about that stuff? This is going to be pretty interactional. If you guys have questions, just throw your hands up. I don't want to wait till the end or anything like that to talk to you all. I hear you guys talking. I hear myself talk all the time. It's better to hear other people talking. So when I talk about studying engagement and health risk behaviors, I'm primarily interested in two systems in the brain that I want to talk about in some detail. The first is the reward system, or what we would call a go system, and the second is a stop system. The go system is thought to be evolutionarily informed. So when we engage in behavior that is likely to lead to propagation of the species, so if we engage in behavior that's going to lead to us surviving or lead to us reproducing, we feel good about that. This serves a purpose, so we'll continue to engage in that behavior. So if we eat a really good meal, we feel good. If we have really good sex, we feel good. If we do other things that are likely to lead to us surviving, we feel good, right? So if we have a near-death experience and we survive that near-death experience, we get what people usually call an endorphin rush. This system is important because it teaches us what to do to stay alive and what to do to stay alive long enough to reproduce. That system is usually fully formed by about the age of 16. What you'll see from my slide is that in females it's fully developed by about 15 years, and in males it's fully developed by about 16 years. I call this the go system. I'll talk more about it in the next couple of slides. We also have a stop system, which I'll call cognitive control. One of the best ways to think about cognitive control is it's the inverse or the opposite of impulsivity. And so this is the stop system. It's fully developed, like I said, in females about 24 or 25, in males about 25 or 26. Anyone notice any problem there? About 10 years where we have a gas pedal and no brake. I don't want you to think about it as an all or nothing though, so it's developing over time. So this stop system is developing slowly, so it's not like all of a sudden at 24 or 25, then we possess the ability to stop, right? But throughout the developmental process, it comes online or it gets stronger and stronger. This may explain to you why some of your adolescents are unable to control their behaviors. They actually, and some of them don't possess this brake pedal they need to be able to stop themselves from doing things. Or they're developing the brake pedal over time. So the go system is directed by the mesocortical limbic system, or the inner to outer part of the brain. It's often referred to as the reward system as well, and it's mediated by the neurotransmitter dopamine. It innervates the areas I talked about that signal for pleasure, that signal for reward, but they also innervate learning and memory. So this is important to think about as an adolescent's engaging in behavior and they're feeling rewarded for the behaviors they're engaging in. They're also learning, and then they're remembering that the activity they engaged in felt good. And what this learning and memory does is it cues individuals about how to act the next time they're in an environment where the same stimuli are present. So if I engage in substance use, and one thing to know is that all substances of abuse activate the reward system. So any substance use is going to cause us to feel good in one way or another. Then I encounter that situation again, my brain will say, hey, it felt good last time we did this. I have a memory of that. I learned that it felt good, so I should do it again. I already described the evolutionary function. It's not clear why substances of abuse activate this system, but it should be clear why things like eating or having sex activate this system if the primary purpose of the system is to allow me to survive until I'm old enough to reproduce. If we think about, again, from an evolutionary perspective, the brain is remembering what allowed me to survive so I could make it to the age where I could reproduce. At a basic level, that's what we're all here for. And it may be, it's primarily an area of the brain that's implicated in addiction. So most substances of abuse or drugs that we use will affect our brain in two places. One is a site-specific place. So if I'm using heroin, it'll affect the opiate receptors in my brain. But it also affects this reward system as well. And the same is true for any substance of abuse. Any substance of abuse is going to have a secondary or primary action in the system. It's going to cause this system to fire. It's going to cause the system to release dopamine. What happens for us as humans we like to be at homeostasis. We like to be at a normal level or an average level. So those of you who are not dieting but who are eating healthy, your body will find its ideal weight, and then it'll be very difficult for you to shift yourself away from that weight because that's where your body wants to stay. When you start using substances of abuse, and this can be anything, so how many of us in here drink coffee? Right. So just so we're clear, the number one substance that people are addicted to in the United States is caffeine, right? And when we use caffeine, we also activate this reward system. The body doesn't like to be, or the brain doesn't like to be overstimulated or over-rewarded. So over time, what the brain will start to do is decrease its own production of dopamine. So this is one of the reasons we start to need more and more of a substance as we use it over and over again. This is a process we call downregulation. So as we downregulate, we start to need more and more dopamine. And so that's really one of the primary processes of addiction, is that the brain stops producing the chemicals it naturally produces that you're putting into your body that replicate those things. So if I'm using heroin at high rates, my body's going to stop producing the natural opioids, and it's also going to decrease production of dopamine. This is why we have withdrawal. So if we stop using a substance, this is why we get sick, because then it takes our body somewhere between 2 weeks and 6 months to recover, to start producing that chemical again to replace what you've now stopped using. So if you think about the process of withdrawal, why do we get sick when we stop using substances? It's because our brain's in deficit. It doesn't have the chemicals it needs to function properly. And so that's the primary addiction process. And you think about both tolerance and withdrawal, which are the hallmark symptoms of addiction. So tolerance is needing more of a substance to get the same effect over time, and withdrawal is getting sick when you remove the substance from the system. Any questions about that? Okay. So then we'll go on and talk about where it is in the brain. When I talk about the mesocortical limbic system, when I said to you the older or inner parts of the brain out to the younger or newer parts of the brain, that's the way the brain develops. So this is the area where we're making decisions, and this is more of the basic area where we have motivations or drives, and this is what we typically refer to as the reward system in the brain. When I talk about the stop system, like I said, it's typically referred to as a cognitive control system. You can also think about it as the opposite of impulsivity. And what the primary purpose is an executive functioning process to get us to stop engaging in a behavior that what we call a habit or a prepotent response. So it gets us it's supposed to stop us from doing stupid things, or supposed to stop us from doing things that'll get us in trouble. Interestingly, it's also mediated by or controlled by dopamine. And dopamine has two different functions. One, it causes us to engage in behavior, and that's in the reward system. And the other, in this system, it causes us to stop engaging in behavior. And so when we think about what we're talking about how do we get ourselves to stop engaging in behavior, this is an area we call executive functioning, or the ability to make decisions and act on or not act on impulses. So if you think about a habit that you have, it's something that, so how many people in here know how to drive a manual transmission? So when you first started driving, it was a pretty difficult thing to do, right? You had to push the clutch in, you had to move the shifter, and you also had to still drive. But how many of you now can do it while you're on the phone or eating a hamburger or talking to your kids, right? So over time it becomes what we call a habit or prepotent response. We don't spend a lot of time thinking about it. Then you might switch into an automatic car for some reason, and you might accidentally hit the brake with your clutch foot. What happens then? You fly through the windshield, right? But the idea is, how do your brain get you to not use your left foot when you're driving an automatic? And that's the idea of cognitive control. You have to think to yourself, don't use your left foot, or I don't need to shift gears, right? So when we get to the level of behavior, if I know that I have to get up and teach tomorrow, then the cognitive control system will indicate to me I probably shouldn't stay out late drinking tonight. Or if I'm getting ready to travel the next day, I can it helps me make plans to make sure I'm on time and get to the airport and things like that. So that's really the cognitive control system. One of the interesting things, and this is a picture of the cognitive control system, again, what you'll notice is this is really in the newer, younger parts of the brain, the parts of the brain that only humans possess that allow us to engage in higher order thinking, being able to communicate using language, and being able to do a lot of the other things that humans can do that animals can't. One of the things that's interesting, like I said, is that drugs of abuse activate the reward system, causing a release of dopamine, feelings of pleasure, and memories of the event. What really happens is when you use a substance of abuse, you're flooding the reward system with dopamine. You're causing an excessive release of dopamine in the system. One of the things that's interesting is that when you flood the stop center, it shuts down. So if you think about how, if you've ever been intoxicated before, how you do dumb things when you're drunk or when you're high, it's because your brain no longer possesses the ability to get you to stop doing it. This is what we typically refer to as disinhibition. So as we become more intoxicated, our brain gets flooded with dopamine, our ability to stop ourselves from doing things that get us in trouble goes away. And this process is on board or is happening the entire time that we're intoxicated, or especially when we're using substances. And I've already talked a little bit about this, but repeated administration of drugs of abuse cause downregulation or cause the brain to stop producing the chemicals that we need to function. And so as we continue to get high over and over again, or as we continue to get intoxicated, drunk over and over again on alcohol, our brain stops producing chemicals to try to offset the impact that we're doing by ingesting substances. So that's a basic idea of how the reward system works in the brain and how the control system works in the brain, how we engage in behaviors and how we make decisions and have power to stop ourselves from engaging in this. That system is present in all of us. And just as a reminder, the reward system fully formed by the age of 16, and the stock system fully formed by the age of 24 or 25. In normal developing humans, that's what we would expect. Questions about, that's the brain. Questions about any of that stuff? I went through it kind of quickly. All right. So when we think about marijuana use, I'm going to give you some stats that I think are pretty important. In 2015, 11 million young adults between the ages of 18 and 25 years reported using marijuana in the past year. Rates of marijuana use among middle and high school students have decreased or leveled off in the past few years, but that was after several years of increase. And the number of young people who believe marijuana use is risky is decreasing. And this part of this message will come across multiple times, that perceived harm around marijuana is decreasing in the United States right now. One of the reasons I think it's decreasing is as states legalize recreational marijuana use, it sends the message that marijuana is not harmful. You're already talking about a drug where many people think it's not harmful. For people who do think it's harmful, when you talk about the state legalizing it, so well, the state wouldn't legalize it if it was going to hurt me. And so we see this trend across the United States where people are believing that marijuana is less and less harmful. And I'll come back to that point a couple of times as I talk tonight. When I talk about perceived harm, marijuana use is significantly increased, and its perceived harm decreased among 8th and 10th graders in Washington state following the enactment of recreational marijuana. In Colorado, the pattern didn't look the same. So I've been collecting data on marijuana use in Colorado since late 2012 or early 2013. Once the recreational marijuana laws were passed and the county started implementing recreational marijuana use, we saw an initial spike in adolescent use. When I talk about adolescent use, I'm talking about individuals between the ages of 12 and 20 for the most part. So up to the age when it would be legal for them to use it. So under the legal age, we saw an increase in the first 6 months of people reporting the first time they ever used marijuana and people reporting how much marijuana they were using. So we see this increase. After 6 months, that increase went away. So for the most part, the message in Colorado is that the legalization of recreational marijuana did not significantly impact the amount of marijuana that was being consumed in the state of Colorado. That is not the case in the state of Washington, and in fact, it's the exact opposite. In the state of Washington, they saw significant increases in the first use of marijuana and significant increases in the amount of marijuana that each individual was reporting using. So the biggest change that happened in Colorado, anyone want to take a guess what was the biggest change in Colorado that may be driving up increased marijuana use? People moving into the state. That was the biggest increase. We were one of the first 2 states to legalize recreational marijuana. We saw an increase in tourism that was expected, but we saw it at a much higher rate than was expected. We also saw an increase in new residents in the state. And anyone want to take a guess about where the most new residents were? College-age kids. We saw significant increases in out-of-state applications at Colorado State University, at CU Boulder, and at CU Denver. One of the things you should know with the college system is that colleges make more money. You may already know this, but colleges make a lot more money off of out-of-state students than they do off of in-state students. So one of the things we saw with the passing of recreational marijuana use in the state of Colorado was a significant increase in revenue across the state. But overall patterns of use among residents didn't change. And if you might know, I mean, there wasn't a big shift in Fort Collins, right? We saw maybe every once in a while you smell marijuana smoke a little more than you might when you were walking through Old Town, but we didn't see significant shifts. Denver looks a little different, right? Because now there's billboards and there's a recreational dispensary on every other corner. But in terms of the day-to-day use, we saw decreases in arrests. We saw decreases in a lot of areas. We did see some increases that I think are important to talk about. We've seen an increase in individuals driving while under the influence of marijuana. And we've seen an increase in emergency room visits for people who are overdosing on marijuana. One of the things about that piece of information, though, is at the same time we've seen a significant decrease in the number of emergency room visits for individuals that are overdosing on opiates. So in the state of Colorado, we see an increase in DUIs, and we see an increase in emergency room visits for individuals who are overdosing on cannabis. We see a decrease in people that are visiting emergency rooms for opiate overdoses. So you might say to yourself, well, what does a cannabis or marijuana overdose look like? Well, you get really paranoid. Your internal body temperature raises, your heart might start to race as well. You might have intrusive thoughts that you can't get rid of. You might get really paranoid, like I said. The best thing to do for someone who's suffering a marijuana overdose is to keep them calm, put them in a quiet space, and let them ride it out. That's much different than someone who's having an overdose to heroin. Someone who's having an overdose to heroin is in life-threatening condition, can probably die. So I'm not saying which one's better or worse. I'll let you make that decision. But it also costs us as taxpayers a lot less to hospitalize somebody who's overdosing on marijuana than it does for someone who's overdosing on opiates of any kind as well. That data is fairly fresh. It's been published. It's coming primarily out of the UC Health system, where they're seeing those decreases in opiate overdoses compared to the increases in marijuana overdoses. Most marijuana overdoses occur because of some of the things that I'll talk about in a couple of seconds, but they're largely related to the amount of THC that's present in our marijuana, which has been changing drastically since the legalization of medical marijuana. So medical marijuana was legalized in 2008, 2009. It's been present for a long time, and that's had a much larger impact on what marijuana looks like for us than recreational. And we'll talk about that in a second, but I want to talk about a little more data about high school students. So the percent of students who report using marijuana in the past year by grade, the green line is 12th graders, the yellow line is 10th graders, and the red line is 8th graders. That line gets to just below 40%. This is nationwide data from a study called Monitoring the Future, which is run by the National Institute on Drug Abuse. So just about 37% of high school seniors report using marijuana in the past year. The percent of students who report any illicit drug use other than marijuana by grade by year is less than 15%. So marijuana is currently the most prevalent substance other than alcohol being used by adolescents in the United States. That's nationwide data. If we talk about what's happening in Colorado, there's a 2015 Healthy Kids survey that indicates that 30% of all high school students report lifetime use of marijuana. This means at any point in their life they've tried it at least one time. Among 12th graders, this number goes to 51%. So 51% of 12th graders in the state of Colorado have at least tried marijuana. In Colorado, there's about 26.7% who report using marijuana for the first time before the age of 15. This becomes relatively important when I start talking about what marijuana does to the brain. And in 26.1% reported use in the last 30 days. Among users, 91% smoked, 28% dabbed, I'll talk about that in a minute, 28% used edibles, and 21% vaped. So this is what marijuana use looks like among 12th graders. For those of you who want to think about what your marijuana use may or may not have looked like if you ever used it, most of us when we were kids, we smoked it or we baked it in some brownies, right? We didn't have a lot of other ways to use it, but kids have a lot different ways they can use marijuana now compared to when we were kids. Well, at least when I was a kid. I'm pretty old at this point. So these are the things I was just talking about. These are the products that I was talking about. So this is what you would expect. This is flour rolled in a joint and smoked. These are concentrates. This is gummies, and these are baked goods. I'm sorry, these are edibles, not concentrates. Gummies and baked goods. This is an example of a vape pen with the oil in it, and these are the concentrates. Concentrates usually referred to as things like wax or shatter or live resin. Anyone want to guess what the typical percentage now in Colorado is for recreational marijuana use for the amount of THC in flower? It's about 16 to 24%. In comparison, the marijuana that we typically use in research that's given to us by the federal government is somewhere between 6 and 8% THC. And it was developed at that level because in the 1980s when they started legalizing or allowing researchers to buy marijuana to do research on, that was the average percentage of THC that was available on the street. You might think of now if someone talking about THC at 8% is what people would typically refer to as ditchweed or dirtweed. But typically if you're buying marijuana from a recreational dispensary, you're getting THC content between 16 and 24. And if you're buying it from the medical side, that can go much higher. It can go higher than 30 to 34%. Compare that to concentrates, or why do I keep saying concentrates? Edibles. These represent 10 milligram doses. If you buy an edible from the recreational side of a dispensary, they'll come usually in 100 milligrams, and they'll be divided up into 10 milligram doses. 10 milligrams is recommended as a starting dose for anyone who's never used an edible before. If you know you're going to have a strong reaction, then they might recommend 5 milligrams. And when you see baked goods, what you're typically looking at is somewhere between 10 and 100 milligrams. So a piece of cake or a brownie could have 100 milligrams of THC in it. One of the other interesting things that we've been finding out as we do research on edibles, especially on gummies, are products where the THC is applied after the product is developed. And so in this case, there are gummies that have THC oils that are sprayed onto the gummies. So there's a research lab in Oregon where you can send gummies, and what they do is they cut the gummies up into pieces and they test each part of the gummy to see if the THC is equally distributed, and it is not in most cases. So if you think to yourself, well, these 10 milligram pieces, if I only want to take 5 milligrams, I just cut it in half. What can happen is you cut it in half is you'll get 0 milligrams, or you'll get all 10 milligrams, or you'll get some fraction thereof. For the baked goods, it's different because the THC is baked into the baked goods. It's pretty evenly distributed. But it's something I like to tell people because people try to be protective. They try not to get themselves too high, and so they cut their gummies up. But the cutting gummies up doesn't doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get equal amounts of THC across the product. We get to the vape pens. The vape pens can range anywhere from 20 to 90% THC. We start getting to upper levels of THC, and you start seeing a much different high. And then concentrates usually range somewhere between 50 and 100% THC. So when concentrates really started becoming much more popular, people started talking about concentrates in the same way they started differentiating between cocaine and crack. And what I mean by that is when you use marijuana that's around 16 to 24% THC, for those of you who haven't used it, there's a slow onset of the high feeling, anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes after you smoke. It peaks around 10 minutes after you smoke, and then it slowly declines over the next 20 to 30 minutes, depending on how much you've smoked and if you've continued to smoke or not. That's the same for vaping. You get a slow high. It really varies based on the amount of THC that you're taking in. For the edibles, it can be anywhere from 30 to 40 minutes before you start feeling any effects. And this creates problems because people think they should be feeling the effects much sooner. So most ER visits for people who are overdosing on cannabis is from people that are using edibles that did not wait for the first effect and took another dose and didn't wait for the second effect and then took another dose and didn't wait for the third effect and then found themselves in the ER because they were much higher than they thought they were going to be. It's important to, and then the last bit is for the concentrates. The concentrates are really referred to as the crack of marijuana. And the reason is because at the percentage that they're at, they're getting individuals much higher, much faster, and they have a much quicker offset. So you become less high much more quickly. What that does is it creates this trough where you're high and then you're feeling sober or worse than sober, and what you want to do is get high again so you stop feeling that sober. So when I talk about a trough, it's the immediate or instant withdrawal from after using a concentrate. Concentrates are usually used in what we call rigs, and you usually use a nail or a torch because they have to be superheated. And so if you see devices like this, you might think, oh, my kid's using crystal meth. No, it looks a lot like a crystal meth pipe, but it's not. It's a cannabis dab rig. When you use concentrates, it's usually referred to as dabbing. So if you hear people talking about dabbing, that means they're talking about using concentrates. This device here is a wand or a dab tool. These are all on tweezers or dab tools. You take a small amount of the dab tool, of the concentrate on the dab tool, you place it on the nail, you place it in the pipe, and then you superheat it with a torch. And so most of you, well, I would assume many of you have not dabbed because it's not common among adult marijuana users. It is, however, quite common among adolescent and young adult marijuana users. So one of the things I do for research is I visit the local marijuana paraphernalia or head shops, and I ask them what currently sells the best, what current methods are being used, what are people looking for. And right now, dab rigs and superheated coils are the most popular things that are selling in head shops. More popular than pipes, more popular than rolling papers. People are buying these devices or they're buying coils. So this is a battery, and this is the oil, and then this is the mouthpiece. When you want to use an oil at this to vape, the battery superheats the oil until it turns into vapor, and then you inhale the vapor. You can buy a coil that sits on the end of this battery that superheats, and it has the same effect as this torch. So you can use concentrates in these devices as well. And again, the point is you need superheat to turn this material into smoke. This material contains much more THC than most of the other material that we'll use. So most people are using, when they dab, they'll smoke anywhere from 1 to 2 to 3 hits, and they'll get very, very high, depending on how often they've been dabbing or using concentrates. And so this is just to provide you some information about what marijuana use looks like today. All of these products can be purchased in both recreational and medical dispensaries, depending on whether you're in-state or out-of-state, or what you want to look for. It depends on how much you can buy. Any questions about any of that stuff I just ran through really quickly? Were most of you familiar with concentrates? Can I show a hand to people who knew about dabbing or concentrates? So it's a different way to use marijuana that like I said, most people aren't familiar with if they're not existing in this world. But it is currently one of the most popular ways to use marijuana. And I'll give you an anecdotal story. So we collect data down in Denver at a marijuana social club, and they host private events. You have to be a member to get in. They've allowed us to collect data there, and they have an event called Huff and Puff. Huff and Puff is a circuit exercise training program like CrossFit with a dabbing bar in the middle of it. So as you're rotating through the space and you're doing your exercises, one of the stations where you stop to do an exercise is at a dab bar where you take a hit and then you keep going. They also have events like Bend and Blaze where you do yoga, and usually you smoke flower or use concentrates at those while you're doing yoga as well. And I don't know how many of you know this, but Denver has passed laws that allow for public consumption of marijuana in these social clubs. And so that'll also change the landscape fairly significantly. Similar to going to a bar and getting a drink, you'll be able to go to a bar and smoke or use marijuana. People are applying for the licenses now, and the clubs are starting to come online. At this point, there is no legislation pending in Larimer County or for Fort Collins to have social clubs, but it might come up. I don't know. Any questions so far? Am I doing on time? All right. Let's see what the next slide says. I don't remember where I'm going from here. Oh yeah, so one of the things I think it's important to think about when many of us were kids, the substances that most of us tried when we were in high school, we probably smoked our first cigarette or used tobacco in some form for the first time. We probably had our first drink. Many of us may have used marijuana as well, but it used to be what I would refer to as a rite of passage drug. The two rites of passage drugs were the alcohol and marijuana. And what do I mean, or alcohol and nicotine. And what do I mean when I say a rite of passage drug? How do adolescents know they're becoming adults? They like to engage in behaviors they see adults engaging in, right? And so we usually had our first drink in high school, and we usually had our first cigarette in high school. Nowadays, it's much different. Nowadays, 61% of 12th graders have reported ever using alcohol. This is nationwide data. 45% reporting any marijuana use, and 28.3% report using nicotine at all. That number is the lowest it's ever. That number is the lowest it's ever been since it was being tracked. Is the best way to think about it, and it looks like it's decreasing. So adolescents are not using nicotine in the same way, and so we used to worry about catching our kids smoking a cigarette. Now what we need to do is worry about our kids catching our kids smoking marijuana. Any questions about this rite of passage data? All right, so I think it's pretty interesting. This happened during our lifetimes. What it indicates is that likely the two campaigns that were executed against nicotine were highly effective. Those two campaigns were spreading information about the health risks associated with using nicotine, but much more importantly, increasing the price of nicotine to the point that most of us couldn't afford to buy cigarettes on a regular basis. Those two things can be really effective at decreasing cigarette use or tobacco use in the United States at all age levels, but particularly among adolescents. So we talk about lifetime substance use in Colorado. 59% of all high school students report having ever used alcohol, 68% by 12th grade. Again, 38% reported ever using marijuana use, and 20% report using nicotine use. So this is data that's not specific to the entire nation, but just in Colorado. So in Colorado, again, nicotine's even lower than it is at the national level. And that could be for any number of reasons. Marijuana is higher, and alcohol use is higher. And like I said, perceived harm likely plays a role in these. So most people understand now that tobacco or smoking nicotine is very bad for you. And so they are less likely to engage in smoking cigarettes. What people often don't realize is that your lungs are actually designed to do one thing and one thing only, and that's breathe air. So if you're smoking anything, you're damaging your lungs. If you're doing anything, you're putting anything into your lungs other than air, you're damaging your lungs. So think about the last time you breathed in some water. You were damaging your lungs then too, and you knew that because you coughed it back up and it hurt really bad, right? But anytime we do anything, put anything in our lungs other than air, we're causing damage. However, people don't perceive smoking marijuana to be as bad as smoking cigarettes. And they'll say things like, well, there's chemicals or pesticides on the cigarettes that aren't on the marijuana, or the filters, or there's carcinogens. Marijuana also is carcinogenic, and currently there are little to no regulations on the pesticides that are used on marijuana, and this includes marijuana that's sold in both recreational and in medicinal facilities. That regulation is still developing at this point in time. So most of us don't know what chemicals are actually being sprayed on the marijuana that we're using or the marijuana that our kids are using. We have little to no idea. And like I said, there are little to no regulations. The other thing to think about is that marijuana is, in fact, a weed or an invasive species of plant. And so most of the pesticides that we use have to be able to not kill an invasive species while killing the bugs and the other things that like to destroy the invasive species. So many of the pesticides that are being used, there's very little known about the effect on the human body because they're not commonly used, right? Most of the pesticides we use aren't used to keep weeds alive. Most of the pesticides that we use in agriculture and are to kill weeds, right? So if we're talking about pesticides that we need to kill pests but not kill the weed, then we're using new and different substances that are being developed all the time. And there are a lot of species that destroy marijuana crops, and so there is a lot of use of pesticides and other chemicals to try to protect the plants. And like I said, without regulation, we don't actually know what's on the marijuana that we're smoking. Even if it's sold as organic, we don't know what that means at this point in time. And Colorado is one of the first states to start developing legislation around regulating pesticides and appropriate labeling for products, but we're still well behind the curve on trying to understand all of these things. So if you think about when I talk about perceived harm, is marijuana less harmful than nicotine? Most of the research indicates that yes, marijuana causes cancer at lower rates than nicotine does. It does not mean it's not harmful. When you think about smoking anything, that's bad for you. People might say, well, vaping's different, right? Why is vaping different? Because you're not smoking it, you're superheating the liquid until it turns into vapor, and vapor isn't the same process. Most recent research indicates that while vapor isn't as bad for you as smoking, it is still bad for you. Why? Because again, you're putting something into your lungs that's not supposed to be there. There's research, one fairly well-defined research study that shows that secondhand smoke from marijuana is as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than secondhand smoke from nicotine. So we think about perceived harm. Marijuana is still harmful, especially when it's being smoked. And so if the message that we're hearing is that marijuana is not harmful, the first way I'd tell you to push back on that is this simple idea. Our lungs are designed to breathe air and nothing else. If we're smoking it, if we're vaping it, we're putting something in our lungs that's not supposed to be there. That's causing us harm. Questions about that? Anyone want to argue with me? Sometimes I get people want to argue with you. Yeah?
How would you then, or maybe you will talk about, gosh, if I don't smoke it, I'm eating it, so no problem.
So it's a good question. So if I don't smoke it, is marijuana harmful? We'll talk about that. The best research suggests that the harm from marijuana, if you're not smoking it, is significantly low and significantly lower than most other substance abuse. So if we're not smoking, if we're using it as edible, if we're using it in any other fashion, so the other things I don't talk about, but now they're starting to develop tinctures or oils that we can rub on our bodies. The absorption rate to intoxication is relatively slow, so most people aren't rubbing THC oil on their body to get intoxicated. They're rubbing oil on their body to ameliorate pain, to relieve themselves of pain. But there are other ways other than just edibles of using marijuana that don't involve smoking. At that point, harm is lower, but that's very dependent on age and on the amount of marijuana that's being used, and that is something I'll talk about in some detail as I push forward through the slides. So perceived harm is lower if you're ingesting, if you're eating it, but there's still harm associated with that. So let's talk about what happens. What is the effect of marijuana on the brain, especially in adolescence? It affects reward and judgment. We've talked about these two things already. Reward, it feels good to use marijuana, right? This is what we call getting high. This is why people laugh. They have a good time when they're intoxicated on marijuana. Judgment, this is the ability to stop ourselves from doing things that we know are stupid or we shouldn't do. Marijuana affects memory. This is the one most people know about. People forget things, they become more forgetful. It affects coordination, it affects our vision, it affects the way we experience the world, and it affects our ability to move. This is all the effects that being intoxicated on marijuana has on the brain. I don't think that's probably not a surprise to most of you. Where does it impact the brain? These are all different areas. The hypothalamus, which is involved in memory formation, the basal ganglia, which is also involved in memory formation and learning, the ventral striatum, which is involved in the areas of feeling reward, the amygdala, which is the emotional experience. When I talk about emotional experience, what's listed here is anxiety, emotion, and fear. It's almost all emotions that the amygdala is working through, though most of us know about the amygdala if we've heard about anger. So anger is also processed through the amygdala, but amygdala is the emotional center of the brain. The brainstem and spinal cord, this is about movement and sensory sensation of pain. The cerebellum for basic life processes. The hippocampus for memory and other areas, and then the neocortex, which is responsible for making decisions and executive functioning. So it's affecting most of the key areas of the brain. It doesn't have significant impact on brain function that keeps us alive. So it doesn't really impact heart rate. Most importantly, it doesn't slow heart rate to the point of stopping, and it doesn't affect breathing. So it's not going to suppress breathing. So what this tells you is that if you overdose on marijuana, you're probably not going to die. And at this point, no one can find any documented cases where overdose on marijuana has been the cause of death. Now, there are cases where people who have been extremely intoxicated on marijuana, they've died. Usually they're behind the wheel driving, or they're involved in other activity that causes them significant injury or death. But marijuana use in and of itself is unlikely to be lethal. And the same is true if you detox or you stop using marijuana. This stopping use of marijuana is unlikely to be lethal. That's not the same for alcohol. So if you are addicted to alcohol and you stop using cold turkey, there's a chance that you could actually die, and that's because alcohol does affect the breathing and heart rate parts of the brain. And so just as a contrast when I say that, so if you detox from alcohol, you could die if you don't do it the right way. If you detox from marijuana, you're unlikely to die. So research conducted on over 1,000 individuals at the age of 13 assessed their patterns of cannabis use at several points as they got older. One of the things I'll talk about a little bit too is that Research on marijuana is very far behind the curve. We do not know all of the things that we need to know at this point in time. Most of that is because of the way the federal government has handled cannabis. So cannabis has been a Schedule I drug since the 1960s, which means it's at the same level as heroin and other substance abuse. And what that means is in order for a researcher to do research on marijuana where we actually give individuals marijuana and observe the results, we have to get a license from the federal government, and then we have to buy all of our marijuana from the federal government. It's all grown at the University of Mississippi, and like I said before, all of that marijuana is around 8% THC by volume, which means it's not really replicating what we're seeing in dispensaries. And at this point in time, there's somewhere between 8 and 10 universities that possess that license. It's called a Schedule I license. And one of those is CU Boulder. And the researcher that has that license at CU Boulder has actually stopped using the marijuana he gets from the federal government because it does not look like the marijuana that people are using in the state of Colorado. So what that means is we know a lot less than we need to about marijuana at this point in time. This data comes from Sweden, actually, and most of the data that we get where we're learning things about cannabis use is actually coming from outside of the United States. We are catching up, and we're starting to do a lot more research on marijuana. The other part of this is that the National Institute on Drug Abuse, which is part of the National Institutes of Health, which is the agency that funds most biomedical research, did not for a long time fund marijuana research. It was not a priority for them. Instead, they were funding methamphetamine research, heroin research, and cocaine research. And so now as marijuana is becoming legal in other states, in 8 to 9 states at this point, the federal government started funding more research on marijuana. So we're catching up, but we're behind. So this data comes out of Sweden. Participants had their IQ tested at the age of 38, and at the time when they were 13 years old, and their IQ scores were compared after controlling for marijuana use. Participants who used cannabis heavily in adolescence and continued throughout adulthood showed a significant decrease in IQ between the ages of 13 and 38. And those who started using marijuana regularly after the age of 18 showed minor declines, but by comparison, those who never used marijuana showed no declines in their IQ. And in fact, we would not expect any declines in IQ over time. One of the things we do when we measure IQ is we adjust for age. So when I measure your IQ at 13 and I measure your IQ at 38, I adjust for your age and calculate a score that's equivalent, right? So we may feel like we're smarter by the time we hit 38 than we were when we were 13. That smarter is just acquired knowledge. How much have I learned in that interim period, that interim 25 years? When I talk about individuals who use cannabis heavily in adolescence and continue throughout adulthood, what I'm talking about is near daily use of marijuana. So if you engage in near daily use of marijuana, you see significant declines in IQ over time. And these results held true even for individuals who showed significant marijuana use during adolescence and young adulthood and then stopped using. So even though they had stopped using, their marijuana use, their IQ was measured at 38, and it was still significantly lower than it was at the age of 13, which means that they did not recover their IQ or their intellectual functioning even though they stopped using marijuana. Most research indicates for individuals under the age of 15, if they start using marijuana under the age of 15 and they engage in heavy marijuana use, near daily marijuana use, they will cause significant permanent damage to their brain. Even if they stop using at some point in their life, they will not recover that brain function. This decreases as they get older. Individuals who start using marijuana after the age of 21 and engage in regular heavy use, if they stop at some point, they will recover that brain functioning or most of that brain functioning. You had a question in the back?
When we get that information, we get copies of these slides.
Yeah, I sent the slides to Russell, and I'm happy to have him distribute them to anybody that wants them. They're not proprietary. I'm happy to share the slides.
Our plan is not to put the slides of the video on our website somewhere so they can be obtained.
So we talk about what happens. Remember, I talked a little bit about neural pruning. I talked about the process of brain development. And these slides, the next couple of slides, are going to show pictures of the brain that usually come from fMRI, or functional magnetic resonance imaging. It's one of the technologies we use to look at brain functioning over time and to compare individuals. So in these slides, what you're looking at are marijuana users versus non-marijuana users. And we're looking at pruning neurons resulting in cortical thickness and gray matter and white matter contrasts. And so what you're seeing is basically divergent patterns in overlapping brain development Those who are using marijuana at higher rates are showing much less activity than those who are using marijuana at lower rates. And again, these are permanent changes that do not recover even after marijuana use stops. So the MRI research results revealed that the more marijuana and the earlier the onset of marijuana use, the greater the cortical thickness and the less gray and white matter contrast, the less intricate the folds and the structures of the brain compared to late onset users. So individuals who start using marijuana at younger ages have less developed and less complex brains, and they do not recover. This is part of the reason we talk about the way the brain is developing. So I'm using marijuana during a critical period. Critical periods are when we expect the adolescent or the brain to either strengthen its connections or remove connections that it's no longer using, cause the brain to underdevelop. We get less folds, we get less white matter, we get less ability to make decisions, to engage in higher order thinking, and to make decisions. Go ahead. When I first started talking, I put up that I also do research on the impact of trauma on neuropsychological functioning. It's not very much different. It correlates pretty highly. Do you have a question? Yes, so this talk is on marijuana, but it would hold true for any substance of abuse that's used before the age of 15. It's a common risk factor that we study whenever we study substances of abuse. What's the age of onset of use, and then what's the frequency or intensity of use after the age of onset. So if you think, go ahead.
Is there any role of neuroplasticity with the new research?
So the question was, is there a role for neuroplasticity? The neuroplasticity is the process of the brain being flexible. So if you experience brain damage at some point in your life, oftentimes what will happen is another part of your brain will redevelop and take over the functioning of the part that's been injured. There is some role for neuroplasticity here, but the data that I presented before indicates that even with neuroplasticity, individuals are not recovering all of their IQ if they engage in this significant heavy cannabis use at early ages. So you will see some recovery over time if the marijuana use stops. And that's likely resulting from other areas of the brain developing and picking up the process, not from areas that have been injured starting to develop at a later stage. And so then there is a small role for neuroplasticity, but you still won't get full recovery. Other questions or comments? Yep.
Can you speak to that slide as it correlates to concussions?
I do not know enough about concussion research to speak intelligently about it, so I probably won't. Typically, the one thing I'll say is typically what we see in the concussion research is not the lessening of connections or the lessening of complexity of the brain, but instead lesions or actual loss of brain tissue, so parts of the brain dying off. And so I don't know how I can't make comparisons about brain development. I just don't know that literature.
Could neurofeedback,
No, go ahead.
neurofeedback help with that?
The research on neurofeedback at this point in time is unclear, and what I mean by that is there's a number of studies that support that it leads to brain development, and there's a number of studies that show that there are no differences. And so right now, the field of neurofeedback is still developing, is what I would say. Yeah.
Have they done very much research on kids who are more moderate users or weekend marijuana smokers, even if it's early onset?
So the Swedish study that I showed you, what they basically did is they just had a large portion of people filling out information. It was not actually a marijuana study. It was just a general lifespan development study. And moderate use, weekend use that doesn't lead to significant intoxication looked a lot like what heavy use looks like in individuals who started after the age of 21. So you'll see some impact at the time, and you'll see, but it generally will not lead to permanent lasting damage, or at least not permanent lasting damage that will significantly impact the individual ability to function. So when we talk about, if I say there's a significant decrease in IQ score, that means that the person's going to understand, or someone's going to notice that they're not functioning at the same level. If you lose 2 to 3 to 4 IQ points, most of us aren't going to notice that. It's not going to have a significant impact. So we're talking about something around the order of 10 to 15 points, or what we usually refer to as a standard deviation loss in IQ score for heavy chronic users. So that'll be part of the message here is that moderated use is not likely to be harmful, especially in individuals over the age of 15. It doesn't mean we should be letting our kids use it, but it's less dangerous.
Talking about heavy use of marijuana, moderate use of marijuana, and people's idea of what heavy is and what moderate is can vary.
Sure.
Could we define qualifier by what a light marijuana user is, what a moderate marijuana user, and what a heavy is? Heavy daily or all day, every day is moderate. Two
Sure, I'd love to. However, there aren't any current definitions, and so it's actually some of the research that I'm doing right now. Well, here's the problem. So marijuana use is currently. So I'll take a side step here for a second. Most people that are conducting marijuana research now previously conducted alcohol research. It's just something we've transitioned into. I've always been a researcher who studied etiological factors or causative factors, so looking at personality and genetics. But alcohol researchers had life pretty easy because, I don't know if you know this, but 12 ounces of beer that's around 5% alcohol by volume is equivalent to 5 ounces of wine that's around 12% alcohol by volume is equivalent to 1.5 ounces of spirits that are 80 proof. And so if I ask you how many drinks you had last night, and then you tell me what kind of alcohol you were drinking, and I know that you were at a bar or that you were measuring your alcohol yourself, then I can get a pretty good sense of how much alcohol you've used. If I ask you how much marijuana you used last night, you have to know a lot of things. You have to know the potency of the marijuana. If you didn't buy it at a rec facility or a medical facility, you don't know the potency. And most research suggests that the labeling is inaccurate on the products that are being sold in rec and medical facilities. So we don't have a good sense of the potency of the marijuana that's being used. I have to know the route of administration. Did you use a concentrate? Did you use oil? Did you smoke it? Did you eat it? And most individuals who are engaging in heavy cannabis use are actually using multiple forms. They're not using just one. And so we gather a lot of qualitative data that suggests that people who who are heavy users will often use edibles in the morning because they're predictable. They know when their onset's going to look like. They have some sense of what the high is going to be like, so they can work while they're using edibles. When they get off work, they might go to happy hour and they might smoke some flower, or they might vape, and then when they get home before they go to sleep, they'll dab, they'll use concentrates. And so then I need to know the potencies for all of those. So most of the way we're measuring marijuana use right now is the easiest way we can, which is frequency. So how many times in the last 30 days, how many times in a typical week? The problem is if I'm using 1 hit a day, and I'll just switch that around. You're using 1 hit a day, and I'm using 15 hits a day. If I'm using a frequency measure that measures how many days in the last 30 days did you use, we're the same person in the analysis, even though your use is much different than my use. So if I'm talking about heavy use, I'm talking about near daily or daily use, and if it's daily use, then repeated administrations during the day. It's very difficult to distinguish between light and moderate users. But you want to think about it as one, some of the risk factors that indicate heavier use, even if it's not daily use. So individuals who are using marijuana alone, marijuana is a social drug. It's uncommon to get high by yourself, especially during adolescence. So if you have an adolescent who's getting high by themselves, that's an indicator of high cannabis use or severe cannabis use. Using in the morning before you go to school or before you go to work, another indicator of high cannabis use or what we consider severe cannabis use. So there's other indicators that we look at. But we're currently conducting research trying to quantify what we mean by light, moderate, heavy user. If I'm talking about a heavy user, I'm talking about near daily use and use to the point of intoxication when they're using.
And moderate weekend?
Moderate would probably be a little more than weekend. Light user would probably be once or twice a month. Moderate user is probably 3 to 4 or 5 times a month, usually on weekends, usually in social settings. There was another question? Yeah. So flower refers to bud, to the grass, to the typical thing that we would all think about when we think about marijuana. If I say flower, I mean green living plant product that we grind up or break up and roll in a joint or pack in a bowl. So it's just one of the ways the field's currently distinguishing between, so flower versus edible versus concentrate are the three that we often use to distinguish the type of product that's being used. Then among those there are differences. So concentrates, like I said, there's wax, there's shatter, there's live resin, and then within edibles there's baked goods and then gummies, and there's lollipops, and there's hard candies, and basically anything you want or can think of, and liquids, which we don't talk about. Concentrates or edibles would also be liquids, so watermelon juice or sodas or coffees that all have THC in them. And then flower typically is bud. Other questions? All right, so I have some more brain slides we'll look at real quick. This is white matter structure differences between marijuana users and non-users. So this is non-users. You see a lot more activity than actual users. So MRI scans of the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is the structure in the brain that connects your right hemisphere to your left hemisphere, and it's the part of the brain that allows the right and left side of your brains to talk to each other. The thicker that is, the more the sides of your brain are able to talk to each other, and the more quickly the sides of your brain are able to talk to each other. The thinner that is, the slower that process. In daily marijuana users, we see a much thinner corpus callosum, and which means our brains are operating a little more slowly and are not able to communicate on both sides as quickly. Asymmetrical brain functioning can lead to a lot of difficulties in life. I'm not going to go into them as much right now. And then what we see here, this one's a little more in depth, but this is another MRI picture that shows general differences in brain functioning. What you're seeing is controls compared to marijuana users. If it's green, it's greater than. If it's red, then it's greater than. If it's green, then it's greater than for controls. And if it's red, then it's greater than for marijuana users. The basic indication here, though, is if we're using marijuana at near daily rates, we're going to be causing significant impairment in our brain that is often lasting. Questions about that? So then we start talking about myths. There are a lot of myths around marijuana use. The first is that marijuana is harmless. For adolescents, marijuana use can lead to increased anxiety, panic attacks, depression, and other mental health problems. Other studies have linked social withdrawal, anxiety, depression, attention problems, and thoughts of suicide in adolescents with past year marijuana use. Other research indicates that adolescents between the ages of 12 and 17 who use marijuana weekly are 3 times more likely than non-users to have thoughts about committing suicide. And a recently published longitudinal study that showed that the use of cannabis increased the risk of major depression by 4 times. That same Swedish study I talked about found a link between marijuana use and increased risk for developing schizophrenia. This risk is conferred both while the child is in utero. So if a mother who's pregnant with a child is using marijuana, that child has a higher risk of developing schizophrenia. And then for adolescent users or users primarily below the age of 13, individuals who are using marijuana at a heavy rate below the age of 13 were more likely to develop schizophrenia as well. So when we think about marijuana as being harmless, it's not. This slide is just about what it does for adolescents. There's been some good research around both anxiety and panic attacks and also around PTSD that shows that marijuana use can offset the symptoms of those disorders. That's true at low doses, not at high doses. At high doses, marijuana actually exacerbates the symptoms of those disorders. And you might ask a very similar question, what's a low dose or a high dose? We don't know. Again, we're so far behind on the curve on marijuana research, I don't know what a low or high dose of marijuana is. Again, it depends on the route of administration, the potency of the product, and then the body's response to the product. Question?
Is there any chance that with some of these kids the mental health was pre-existing and it's a self-medication, like marijuana?
Okay. So the question is there a situation where these symptoms may have been present before marijuana use and that marijuana use was for self-medication? There's a lot of evidence to suggest that individuals who are experiencing psychological distress use marijuana as a way of treating their psychological distress. So this is correlational data. I don't know what the onset is. But among adolescents who use marijuana on a near daily basis, all of these symptoms are more prevalent and they're more severe. And so so you can talk about what we usually refer to as a stress diathesis model or predisposition to disorder. Marijuana use at young ages could be seen as a stressor that causes the disorder to become prevalent as well. So because it could be seen as a traumatic experience that can lead to the development of disorder. Other questions? So another myth is that marijuana is not addictive. According to the 2015 National Survey on Drug Use and Health, 4.3 million Americans were classified with cannabis use disorder in the past year. That figure represents about 1.8% of the US population and 60.3% of those individuals classified with substance use disorder. So I'm going to point out this again. So 60.3% of individuals who meet diagnostic criteria for having a substance use disorder or have a substance use disorder that involves marijuana. The most prevalent admission to treatment facilities in the United States right now is for cannabis use disorder or for being addicted to marijuana. How many of you here think that marijuana is not addictive? It's okay to raise your hand. It's a common thought. And so one of the things that we need to do a better job of as researchers is indicating to you that about 1 in 10 heavy marijuana users or moderate marijuana users, depending on how you want to define the terms, will become dependent on marijuana. One of the reasons we don't think about marijuana being addictive is because, you can't get physically addicted to marijuana. This is the fault of researchers. Physical addiction to a substance occurs when there's a primary system in the brain that uses a similar chemical. So one of the reasons that heroin is so addictive is because our body produces its own opioids. And those primarily cause us to not feel pain. So if we didn't have endogenous or internal opioids, air pressure would hurt. Gravity would hurt us. So we have these internal opioids to dull the pain of living on Earth, right? As we start to use heroin, our body stops producing those endogenous opioids, and so we get what we call a physical addiction. Most of the areas of the brain where these physical addictions are occurring are in the synapse, which is the space between two neurons. That's where the chemicals are being released, and most of the receptors that we end up looking at are on the postsynaptic side of the synapse, or the end point. The marijuana receptors in the brain were not identified until much later, and they're called cannabinoid receptors. And the primary ones you'll hear about are CB1 and CB2. Cannabinoid receptors exist on the presynaptic side of the synapse. And so researchers, it took us a long time to find those receptors. Once we found those receptors, then it was obvious to us that there could be physical addiction to marijuana. Without those individualized receptors, there was no evidence of it. So we've developed research around looking at CB1 and CB2, which are cannabinoid receptors, and we've identified endocannabinoids. Endocannabinoids are cannabinoids that are being produced by the body. Those two things mean we can have physical dependence on marijuana. What does physical dependence on marijuana look like? It doesn't look much different than what physical dependence on caffeine looks like, actually. And that's another reason why people think marijuana is not addictive, because when they think about addiction, they think about things like addiction to heroin, or addiction to alcohol, or addiction to tobacco. But what do you feel like if you don't have your coffee every morning? What if I took your coffee away for 2 weeks? What would happen? You have a headache, you'd have sleep disturbance, you'd have appetite disturbance. You wouldn't really be a pleasure to be around, you'd be grouchy. I have an anecdotal story. So my sister came to visit one time, and she was with us, and she woke up in the morning and she said, "Where's the coffee?" My wife said, "Well, it's in the cabinet right there." And then she said, "No, where's the coffee?" My wife said, "It's in the cabinet right there." And then she said, "No, that's decaf, that's not coffee." And my wife and I had been fighting every morning for about 10 days, and I couldn't figure out why. And it's because my wife didn't realize that she had bought decaf and had been drinking decaf coffee for 10 days. Marijuana dependence. If you smoke every day and you are dependent on marijuana, this means that you cannot control your use. You've made attempts to reduce your use and they've failed. You use more than you plan to use. Your use has stopped you from being able to go to work or to go to school. So basically it's interrupting your ability to function in the day-to-day. At that point, we'd classify you as having cannabis use disorder. You also show evidence of tolerance, so you need more marijuana to get to the same high as you did previously, and you show evidence of withdrawal. If you withdraw from marijuana, you get the same symptoms. You feel grouchy, you get a headache, you get sleep disturbance, you get appetite disturbance. Lasts about 2 weeks for most people. Some people it lasts a little bit longer, but on average it'll last about 2 weeks and then it'll go away. It doesn't mean it's not addictive. What it means is that the addiction probably isn't anywhere near as severe as the addiction to other substances. But people do get dependent on cannabis. They do get an addiction, and it is currently the most prevalent admission in drug treatment facilities in the United States. And again, 60% of individuals who are classified as having a substance use disorder by mental health or medical professionals have a dependence on cannabis. Questions about that? So it is a myth that cannabis is not addictive. If you want to know the number, the real number is about 1 in 10. 1 in 10 individuals will develop dependence on cannabis. So in states like Washington, where they're seeing significant increases in cannabis use and in cannabis users, they're going to see increases in the number of people that are dependent on marijuana. We might not see increases in the state of Colorado because, again, at this point, marijuana use in Colorado is holding steady. However, that changes when you start to think about the changing percentages of THC. So prior to the legalization of medical marijuana and prior to the legalization of recreational marijuana, there wasn't really a significant push to increase the potency of the marijuana we were using. People would start to use hydroponic light to grow their marijuana, or they developed strains like crypto, which they thought were much more potent. But again, we're talking about 10 or 11% THC. Most of the products that people are buying in medical and recreational facilities are much higher than that. And we don't have a real sense of how higher potency is going to impact the prevalence of cannabis use disorder or the addictive properties of cannabis, but the likelihood is that it will increase. So if people start using concentrates at higher and higher amounts or with higher and higher frequencies, we expect that those people are going to likely struggle with addiction more than people who are smoking flower or using edibles. Does that make sense to everybody? What other myths? Anyone else have myths that they've heard about marijuana that they want to talk about, they want me to talk about? When you think about marijuana use, what do you think about? How many people in here think that marijuana use is bad for you? How many would raise your hand before I talked? I'm just curious. I don't, and people often ask me what my personal opinion is about cannabis use. I don't share that as a researcher. It's not important what I think about cannabis. I do think that it's important to remember that if you're smoking marijuana, if you're smoking anything and you're doing damage, that secondhand smoke from marijuana is carcinogenic. It will hurt people around you. That marijuana does impair driving. There's a lot of research going on in the country. There's a myth, one of the common myths is that marijuana actually improves driving. There is no research evidence to support that. In fact, there is research evidence to the contrary, that it impairs driving. The field sobriety tests that most police officers use are not always as accurate in detecting marijuana use compared to detecting alcohol use, so we're trying to develop new field sobriety tests to get a better sense of who's driving impaired and how they're driving impaired. But that's a common myth too, is that marijuana improves performance at some level. It does not improve driving performance. I think your hand was up first. So the question is about whether marijuana is being used as a gateway drug. The gateway hypothesis among researchers has largely been debunked at this point in time, in the sense that the substance is the gateway is not likely. So much of the research I look at is individual factors that predispose people to engage in substance use. And really what's likely the gateway effect that we're seeing are genetics and environmental opportunity. So a specific substance isn't likely to lead. So just because an adolescent uses marijuana does not mean they're much more likely to use another substance. The marijuana is not causing that. Individuals who use marijuana at heavy rates are predisposed to use other drugs. And so part of that is the way we do statistics, but the idea is now I'm looking at individual differences. So an adolescent who's using by themselves or who's using in the morning, regardless of what substance they're using, they're likely to be using multiple substances. And that is likely related to both genetics and early environment or environmental experience. But not the drug itself, use of marijuana does not lead to the use of other substances. Most of that research has been debunked at this point in time. Same thing for alcohol. Alcohol is not considered a gateway drug, right? So using alcohol is not likely to lead to you using another drug. Now, going to parties where alcohol is being used is likely to lead to you being exposed to people who are carrying marijuana, and you, as an individual, may say to yourself, hey, that guy's got weed, I want to try weed. But so that's what I mean when I talk about environmental influence. It's not that using alcohol leads you to want to use another drug, but using alcohol at a frequent rate exposes you to people who are using other drugs, and that may pique your curiosity and lead to you using other drugs. But the substance in and of itself is not likely to lead to you using another substance.
Back to the driving part.
Yeah.
I was going to say, yeah, when this is the driving thing that it does affect. So you said it does affect, and how does it affect? You're much more clear on the fact that alcohol at very, very low percentage is not impaired. At a certain level, you're driving while ability is impaired. At a higher level, you're driving ability and so on. So it's pretty benchmark as to how much your BAC is and what's happening there. What about marijuana? So and you talked about the delay in reaction to getting there. So there's the take it, there's delay in going up, then you're high. How far do you have to come down before you're quote unquote safe to drive, and how long would that take, and how has to do with how much you consume, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, we don't know. You can keep asking me those questions, I'm going to keep giving the answer. At this point, we don't know. I can tell you the areas the brain's impacting, but most of us know those are right. So it's going to affect reaction time, it's going to affect coordination, it's going to affect decision making. Those are all things that are imperative for driving, right? Deciding whether to stop or go, deciding whether to change lanes, being able to then execute that maneuver, all of those things are impaired when you're high on marijuana. But to give you the definition of high on marijuana and at what point it's impairing driving, all of that research is being done now. In fact, much of the research has been funded by the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, is looking at the impact of cannabis use on driving and looking at the impact of cannabis use on in utero, on pregnancy and breastfeeding. So.
Part of it is people who are using marijuana and who can cannabis on marijuana. A new study says you don't know. Say, oh well, if once I smoke a joint, 3 hours later I'm going to drive.
No, there's no evidence of that actually. Yeah, there's no evidence of that, and like I said, the research is being conducted now, but it's difficult research to conduct in terms of, because even though recreational marijuana is legal in the state of Colorado, it doesn't change the fact that if I want to do administration studies, so if I want to get people high and then put them in a driving simulator, which Colorado State has, it has a driving simulator, I have to get a Schedule I license, and then I have to buy marijuana from the University of Mississippi. Most individuals who live in Fort Collins who use marijuana on a regular basis will not smoke the marijuana that comes from the University of Mississippi, because it's a waste of their time, because it gives them a headache, because it's ditchweed, right? So we've started engaging in observational studies, but those are much slower and much less likely to produce viable results because of the nature, right? If I don't have experimental control, it's much more, I'm looking at correlations more than causation. And so it's going to take us a lot longer. But we're working on it. Other questions? Other myths, yeah?
Yeah, I've heard that marijuana used in certain forms is non-carcinogenic. Is that true?
So the question is marijuana used in certain forms, is it non-carcinogenic? The research is still out. And some of this is because of how the chemical is being treated. So THC is not necessarily carcinogenic, but most of us aren't using pure THC. Even when we're spraying THC on our edibles, it's coming from plant material that's been reduced to a liquid form. The plant material has been treated with chemicals. Chemicals are likely carcinogenic. So the product that we're using is likely carcinogenic, but THC in and of itself, probably not carcinogenic. But even in an edible form, we're still ingesting some carcinogens. Yeah?
Are you going to talk about the alleged
So the question is, I'm going to talk about the alleged medical benefits. At this point, I think we can actually say that they're more than alleged, that there's good research that suggests that there are medicinal benefits from the plant material. The question is, from what part of the plant material? So the part that we talk about that's what we call psychoactive, or the part that gets us high, is THC. Most of us understand that there are other chemicals that are involved in the plant. The one that's primarily getting the most attention right now is CBD, or the cannabinoid, or cannabidiol. There's good research to suggest that cannabidiol has medicinal benefits. However, they're much more limited than what we've been told, right? So what I'm talking about now is research evidence that I've read that has unequivocal support for. And what that usually means is that research that's been found in one study and replicated in at least one other study conducted by a different lab. So most of the science rests on the idea of replication. Some of you may know that replication is a big problem in our field right now. But if I'm talking about medicinal benefits of marijuana, then I will talk about studies that have been replicated. So CBD is non-psychoactive. You do not get high from CBD. You can extract CBD from marijuana plants and use it without getting high. It's been shown to offset the effects of chemotherapy, especially as related to nausea, so it calms the stomach. It's been shown to offset the negative impact from cataracts, and it's been shown to reduce the amount of seizures in very specific types of epilepsy that involve multiple seizures per hour. Individuals that are having seizures as much as once per minute. CBD and at some small amounts THC will significantly reduce the amount of seizures those individuals are experiencing. And that's basically it. Yeah. Most of the products that I have on the board do not include CBD. If you want CBD, you can get it. It comes usually in the form of oils. Some flour now has some percentage of CBD and some percentage of THC, but it would be rare to have a marijuana product that you buy at a recreational facility that just has CBD. CBD is also not illegal. So one of the things interesting, and I don't know if the high school administrators know it here, but there's actually no legislation that bans CBD use among adolescents as well. And so adolescents can use CBD, they cannot use THC. Anyone under the age of 21, anyone at any age can use CBD. Anyone under the age of 21 without a medical card cannot use THC. And so, yeah, go ahead.
So how does the exogenous use of CBD affect the endogenous use of endogenous CBD and the receptors?
So the question was about the idea of how does exogenous CBD affect endogenous CBD. Endogenous is not CBD actually, so cannabidiol does not have an endogenous component. And the endocannabinoids are much more closely related to THC than they are to the CBD. And so but there's very little understanding at this point about why CBD has the effects that it does. There's actually a fair amount of research being conducted at CSU right now using only CBD and using it in animals to see if we can determine what the effects are. It's not lethal to animals. THC, by the way, lethal to dogs. Do not give your dogs weed, it will kill them. And now you might think, well, I blew smoke in my dog's face when I was a teenager and he survived. I mean, if they eat a large amount of THC, and now that we know that the concentrations of THC are increasing in the products we have available, it can kill your dog. CBD, non-lethal to dogs. So they're starting to try to do research on why CBD has pain ameliorative effects, why it reduces nausea, and what impact it has on the seizures. It's not clear at this point.
So what I'm hearing you say is we don't know how it affects the endogenous receptors then.
Correct. We don't know how it affects the endogenous receptors. It's actually really unclear why it has any role in treating epilepsy at all, other than decreasing brain activity, but we don't know. And again, when I say we don't know, I want you guys to be clear. It's not because we're not trying, but the federal government has really put a damper on the amount of research that we can do. So it's only been recently that they passed any kind of legislation at all that allowed for research using just CBD, because it was considered part of the marijuana plant product up until very recently. It was still controlled by the Schedule I licensing. I think all of that's going to change very drastically in the next 5 to 10 years. We're going to learn a lot more and a lot more quickly. But right now, when I tell you I don't know, it's largely because the research that we've been doing has been fairly hampered by regulation and legislation. Other myths or questions that you guys have about marijuana use? I think I have 1 or 2 more slides. Let's see what I got next. Oh yeah, we're going to talk now about how we talk to our kids. So this has been a topic where I've gotten a lot of requests, and that is, how do we talk to kids about adolescent use, or about marijuana use? And so some of my slides today may have scared you about the use of marijuana, and it may not have. You know, I talked about positive benefits. I talked about the idea that moderation's not really a bad thing. So moderate use of THC has not been shown to be problematic in most cases. This is not true. Anyone under the age of 15 should, in my opinion, should not not be using marijuana or any other chemical because it has the ability to have a significant impact on brain development that is permanent, is unchangeable. So for me, at the very least, the minimum age would be 15 of any use at all. And regular use, I do think that 21 is a good number. I actually think if I had my druthers, I wouldn't allow any illegal substances until the age of 24. Again, if the idea is we want our brain to be fully developed before we start altering it, then 24 is the number we'd look at. However, single use of marijuana or infrequent use of marijuana at low doses is not harmful. So if we try to talk to our kids about how bad marijuana is for them, and they've experienced it, or they've talked to their friends about it, and they've met people who use it at a fairly regular basis, if we don't present a clear message to them, then they're likely not going to believe what we're saying. Right? So if we try to present marijuana as being this really harmful drug, it's important to understand that at this point in Colorado and many other states where recreational marijuana is legal, most kids don't think marijuana is bad for you. I presented evidence today that it is. I've also presented evidence today when it's not. And so hopefully you can use that information to have a more informed conversation with your teenagers. If adolescents have already tried marijuana, and so if you think about that, so what was the number of people, of 12th graders who had ever tried marijuana in the state of Colorado? It's about 60% roughly, right? So if this room had 100 people in it, 60 of those people would have a kid, I'm assuming all of us have kids, would have had a kid who have tried marijuana at least one time at the 12th grade. At 8th grade, that number was closer to around 26%. So thinking about those numbers, if kids have already tried marijuana and they haven't experienced harm from it, and then we start talking to them about being harmful, they're also not going to listen to what we're saying to them. Does that make sense to you? So questions about that? How do we talk to our kids about marijuana use? Have you guys talked to your kids about marijuana use? When you talk to them, what is the nature of the conversation? You tell them not to do it? You tell them it's bad for them? I don't want you to raise your hand to this one. You give them marijuana. You say, oh, go ahead and try it. It's not that bad. Don't. There's a police officer in the room. Don't admit to that. Question in the back?
Oh, I was just going to say, when we talk to kids about it,
I'm having trouble hearing you, sorry.
oh, we talk to them about it the same way we did about alcohol.
Right, and
all other
that's a good point, and that's one of the messages I'd like to talk to you guys today. You should be able to talk to your kids about marijuana in the same way that you would talk to them about alcohol use and about nicotine use. And if you're not talking about all three, you need to start. Because if you don't, they're going to get the information from someplace. And that someplace is either their friends or the internet, both of which are horrible sources of information. But at this point, if recreational marijuana is legal in the state of Colorado, we should be able to have the same kind of conversation about recreational marijuana use that we can have about alcohol use. We should be able to have that amongst ourselves, right? So we should be able to freely talk to each other about whether we use marijuana or not, what kind of marijuana we use, when we use it, how we use it. Some of us, I mean, how many people would feel uncomfortable talking to me about your marijuana use? I would feel uncomfortable talking to you about my marijuana use. I'll put my hand. No one else going to put your hand up? You'd all feel comfortable talking to me about your marijuana use? I don't buy it. I don't buy it. That's taboo, right? That's just holdover from where we were when we were kids or how we grew up, right? But the idea is, so as a professor, I have graduate students that work for me, that do research for me. Oftentimes we'll go to social events. At those social events, there might be alcohol present. Most grad students are over the age of 21. I am very clearly over the age of 21. So I've had a beer or two with my grad students. At one point, one of my grad students asked me if I wanted to smoke marijuana with him. Both over the age of 21, legal in the state of Colorado. We were in a private residence at the time, and I wasn't comfortable doing it. And many of you might say you shouldn't have been comfortable doing it. But why is it any different than if I had a beer with him? And maybe you'd say, well, you shouldn't have had a beer with him, and that's a viable argument. But why is it any different, right? And so these are the things. If we treat marijuana differently than we treat alcohol, then we're probably sending a message that we don't want to send. And that message can go in a number of different ways, right? So if we talk about alcohol in ways that are inappropriate, it might push our kids to drink. Without showing your hands, think about how many of you said, it's okay if my kid has my beer. It's okay if my kid has a beer. As long as they're around me and I'm watching them, then I feel comfortable with that alcohol use. In some states, that's legal. In some states, it's legal to give minors alcohol as long as an adult who is their parent or guardian is giving them that alcohol, right? So most of us have thought about, well, what it would be like if my 15 or 16-year-old had a drink, if they had one beer. How many people think one beer for a 16-year-old is a bad thing? A couple people here and there, right? How many people think one hit for a 16-year-old is a bad thing based on what we've talked about today? But what I've told you is that most of your kids are going to try marijuana. And the question is, how do you get them to talk to you about it so they can make informed decisions? Because after coming to this talk, you've got more information. And you probably are better at sifting through information you find on the internet, so you might be able to find better information. The Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment has invested a lot of money in trying to educate both parents and adolescents about marijuana use. The campaign's called the Good to Know campaign. Show me a raise of hands how many people have heard of the Good to Know campaign. They spent millions of dollars, and I saw about 6 hands go up. If you want to find out more information, then Google Good to Know. And you can get a lot of information about how to talk to your kids. There's materials there that you can use to share with them. But I agree, you should be talking to your kids the same way you talk to them about sex, the same way you talk to them about alcohol or nicotine use is the way you should be talking to them about marijuana use. What we find among parents is actually a fairly, what we call a bimodal distribution, or parents on either end of the spectrum. Parents who don't think marijuana is bad for you, and so they talk to their kids about the fact that marijuana is not bad for you. Or parents that think that marijuana is very bad for you and talk about it as if it's the worst thing you could possibly do. What we need to do is get to the middle and think about, yeah, there's risks. It's not good for people under a certain age. It's not good to be using it all the time. It's not legal to be using it. So if an individual under the age of 21 or without a medical card under the age of 18 is using, they're committing a crime. It's important to remember that. It does impair driving. One of the interesting things that we saw, we conducted some research where we had individuals go through an online intervention to try to reduce their marijuana use. And we talked about the dangers of driving while intoxicated. And we found this really interesting effect. We did see a significant decrease in individuals who reported driving while intoxicated. However, we saw the same increase in individuals who reported riding in a car with someone who was intoxicated. The person driving was intoxicated. So they were high, they decided not to drive, but they got in the car with their friend who was also high. So it didn't really have the effect we wanted it to have. So thinking about and talking to our teens about the impact it has on driving, especially if they have some of these preconceived notions that it's not harmful, that it makes our driving better. That's one I've heard a lot, and that's why I keep coming back to it. You hear all the time, oh, it makes my driving better because I'm calm, because I'm not as anxious, because because the world's moving at a slower pace for me. Those are all bad reasons to think that would be making your driving better. So talking to kids about these things in an open and honest way in the middle of the road, presenting both the harms and the understanding that moderate use is probably not going to have long-term lasting impact, but could still result in some pretty significant consequences. The other thing is, like I said, talk honestly. So your adolescents likely already know or have thought about marijuana use at this point. And if you haven't thought about that, then hurry up. They have their own opinions and have heard about marijuana use from their friends. Trying to get a sense of what opinions your kids have can help you form the discussion you want to have with them. If they perceive you as being dishonest or dramatic, they will discount what you say. What do I mean when I say dishonest or dramatic? How many of you would feel comfortable talking to your kids about your marijuana use? You don't have to raise your hands, it's okay, just think about it. You might talk to your kids about your alcohol use. I would guess that many of you have had alcohol, consumed alcohol in front of your kids. It's not that unusual to have a glass of wine with dinner, to go out and have a cocktail, to have a beer when you're in the house, and your kids see you drinking. That informs them that drinking is acceptable. That teaches them that it's okay to drink. It's one of the reasons that adolescents engage in drinking behavior, because one of the things adolescents want to do is they want to be adults. So what adolescents will do is they'll imitate what you do, right? So one of the reasons we think that nicotine use has decreased so much among adolescents is because it's decreased at the same rate among adults. If parents aren't smoking cigarettes in front of their kids, kids are much less likely to smoke cigarettes, right? So if you think about, if you're willing to use alcohol in front of your children, are you willing to smoke marijuana in front of your children? If so, in both cases, what's the message that you're sending to your children? So if you're using alcohol and you say, well, I can drink this beer, but you can't have any because it's going to kill you, they're probably not going to believe you. They're probably going to think you're full of it. And they're going to think you're a hypocrite, right? If you're using marijuana, or even if you're not using marijuana, but they know there's marijuana in the house and that you sometimes use marijuana, and then you're telling them it's bad for you, don't ever do it, that's being dishonest at some level, right? And so the dramatic side is sort of the other side of that, which is saying it's going to, going back to the reefer madness days, we're saying it's going to kill you, or saying it's the worst thing you could possibly do. Probably don't want to do that either. But again, presenting a balanced view, and don't ever think that your adolescent doesn't know what you do. So if you use marijuana, it's a very good chance that your adolescent knows that you use marijuana. And I would keep that information in mind when having a conversation with my teenager about marijuana use. Go ahead.
What about kids who are on meds, like taking antidepressants, things like that? Would you talk to them about it differently, or?
So one of the ways that I talk about, so the question was if I have a child on meds, especially antidepressants or other psychotropic medication, would I talk to them about it differently? I certainly would. There's good evidence to suggest that marijuana interacts with prescription medication in ways that we don't fully understand, but that it does have an impact. The other way that I often talk to kids as well is, if there's a history of addiction in your family, the likelihood is that your child is higher risk for developing addiction than his peers or her peers. I want you to think about that. If there's a history of addiction in your family, and by family I mean up through your great-grandparents, including your aunts, uncles, and cousins at least 2 to 3 levels out, if there's a history of addiction in your family, it means there could be genetic predisposition that runs in your family to addiction. That means that if your child tries a substance and they have a genetic predisposition to addiction, they're much more likely to become addicted to the substance than their peers. They often don't understand that. Many times we don't talk about addiction history in our family because it's taboo, because it's bad, because the people might be incarcerated. But if you know of a family history of addiction, you should be talking to your children about the fact that they are at increased risk. Their body is not going to respond to the substance in the same way that their friends' bodies respond to the substance. That's probably the most important conversation you can have with your children. If there's a history of addiction in your family, they have a higher probability of becoming dependent on substances, and they're likely going to respond to substances in ways that are different than their friends. So if you think about the first time that you got intoxicated on alcohol, most of us got sick or passed out or had some unpleasant experience. Research suggests that when addiction runs in the family, the first time an individual gets intoxicated on alcohol, they actually enjoy it. They have a much different experience. So medications, if they have psychological disorders that are not being medicated because maybe we don't want to medicate our children because they're in talk therapy instead, they may experience marijuana in a different way as well. They may experience alleviation of their symptoms, which then will cause them to want to use more because they're feeling some relief. So talking to them about it as well. If you have a child who's anxious, then the 2 disorders that show the highest prevalence of co-occurring marijuana use disorder are depression and social anxiety. Why? Because the drug tends to ameliorate those symptoms fairly well. So if you're socially anxious and you get high, you're less socially anxious. For kids, social anxiety usually comes about when they have to go into a social situation and they have to perform at some level and they're going to be evaluated in some way. Where does that happen most? Well, here, right, in school, or when they're out with their friends. And so they use marijuana and they realize that they can get control of their anxiety. Then they're much more likely to develop prolonged and severe marijuana use. Depression, it tends to lift those really sad feelings a little bit. And so all of those things, I think if your children are dealing with those things, you should have targeted conversations with them about how they're going to react differently than their peers or how the substance may have a different impact on them. That's part of the honest conversation. Again, if you know, the reason I'm stressing this, the addiction piece, is because it's the research area that I'm most interested in. I also know that most families don't talk about a history of addiction if it's not impacting the day-to-day life of the individual, and even sometimes when it is impacting the day-to-day life of the individual, we don't talk about it. But it will predispose children to becoming dependent. I've published a number of studies that show that link. So thinking about those things, definitely want to incorporate those in the conversation. Other questions? I think.
When you say addiction, you're talking to any substance. I mean, alcohol, other drugs.
Any addiction. You could make the argument for also pathological gambling, internet addiction, food addiction, or sex addiction, all of them being researched and showing that they have similar genesis or origins in the brain. So any addictive behavior is likely to predispose. And just so we're clear, when I talk about kids being at higher risk if there's a family history, the risk is fairly low for addiction. In most cases, it's somewhere between 1 and 15% of the population. If you have a family history, that will likely increase from somewhere between 6 and 30%. So it's a significant increase, but it's not a lock, it's not a guarantee. It's just a significant increase. The one thing we do know is that in families with these histories of addictions, people experience highs in different ways, and much more likely to experience pleasure the first time they're intoxicated, much less likely to experience consequences. Hangovers are much less frequent. Immediately having higher tolerance is much more frequent. Being able to function while intoxicated is more prevalent, and so it can come in it doesn't just mean that your adolescent's going to become addicted, but it could have a number of different effects. Other questions? Yeah.
This might be kind of a silly one, but does it turn their lungs black, like nicotine? We have some pictures of that. And also, with the nicotine piece and how it was fought in the public limelight, are we up against that with marijuana?
So the two questions were, one, does marijuana smoke or smoking marijuana turn your lungs black in the same way that tobacco or nicotine use does? I don't immediately know the answer to the question. I haven't seen a lot of research. Most of the studies can't be done until individuals are dead, and we haven't been studying marijuana in that way. The other thing is that for the people that have died and that we could study at this point, up until very recently, marijuana and nicotine use was highly comorbid. So people who were smoking marijuana were also smoking cigarettes, and so it'd be very difficult to disambiguate what caused, to separate what caused the black lung. And then the other point was, remind me?
Like the DARE
Right.
when we were younger.
By the way, everyone should know that DARE doesn't work. I don't mean, but people thought that DARE worked, but for many kids, DARE actually educated them about drug use instead of telling them about the dangers of drug use. And so we find very mixed results from DARE. Right, so the question was, the way we fought nicotine or the way we fight other substances, will it work with marijuana? The big difference is the negative medical and physical effects of marijuana are not as obvious as they are for nicotine and for other substance abuse. And as states legalize recreational use, it sends the message that marijuana is not bad for you. So I think it's a much harder battle to fight. That's the best answer I have for you. It's going to be a different kind of campaign probably. Other questions? Yeah.
I've heard parents want to drug test their kids for marijuana. Can you speak to that?
So there are instant cups you can get. You can get where they can pee in a cup and it'll tell you what substances are in their body. What would you do if you found out your kid was using marijuana? I mean, I would assume that most of your kids have been around marijuana at this point, that some of them have used it, some of them are going to use it soon. Knowing that they're using it isn't really going to do much for you, and what it tells you is that what it tells your teenagers that you don't trust them. So what I would encourage you to do instead is try to develop a good relationship with your teenagers so they feel comfortable talking to you about their marijuana use, talking to you about their alcohol use, or talking to you about their nicotine use, and talking to you about their sexual behavior. Because all of those things are things they should be talking to you about. And if you think about the general statistics and we talk about the idea of, so my next slide is this idea of openly, have a discussion with your teenagers. Have a discussion with any of your children about these things. Don't talk at them, but talk with them. Ask them what their preconceived notions are. Ask them what their opinions are. Ask them if they're interested in trying marijuana, and then talking to them about the ways that they could or should not be doing that. Right? Remembering that it's illegal, remembering that if they're doing it in public or if they're doing it at somebody else's house, these things are all going to be problematic. Not encouraging the use. I don't encourage individuals to provide alcohol or marijuana to their underage adult, children. It's not a good idea. It sends the wrong kind of message. So that's another common myth, right? Well, if they're using it at home where I can watch them, they're going to be safe. They're going to be safer, or I'm going to be in control. I don't recommend that course of action. It's still illegal and still dangerous for your children. Go ahead. Congratulations.
Very comfortable that she's not a partier, and as far as I know, she's not been drunk yet. My concern is she's going to college, and she hasn't led us well. We don't drink openly in front of our children because we just don't drink. My mom does. Other people do in our family. We just talk to them about, what the consequences are of that, and old enough, and ways. But I am definitely conflicted about how her going to college is going to affect. I mean, she's got a great background.
Sure. So we did, like I said, we ran an intervention study this past year at CSU, and one of the things we found is that the initiation or the rate of first use of marijuana among naive users, people who have never used marijuana before in the state of Colorado, is double that in other states. So if your child's going to go to college in Colorado, then you should be having a conversation about the fact that they are going to be around marijuana, and they should figure out how they're going to use it, what decisions they want to make, whether they're going to use it or not. But it's unlikely that they'll be able to avoid it in the state of Colorado. It's very common. The rates of initiation among college kids, it's one place where it's higher than in other states, and we did see an increase after recreational marijuana became legal, is first use in college is higher. And so having a conversation with your adolescents about what happens when they transition, when they go to college, what they might be dealing with would be a good idea. And the fact that at some point it's going to become legal for them as well. And so there is a lot of common myths about teaching our children how to appropriately use alcohol before they get to a legal age where they're outside of our control and might do something stupid. And I think you can do that through conversation, not by example or by experience. But having a conversation about, again, the other thing is if your child goes off to college and has this idea that marijuana is very harmful, they're going to be bombarded with messages that it's not. They're going to be bombarded with messages that it's typical, that trying it's not that big of a deal, and they're going to be conflicted. And they might not feel as comfortable talking to you about it because they've had a really open relationship, but it's not been a behavior they've been engaging in. And so I would still be proactive and have a conversation about what it looks like. There are most universities now, there's about 300 that are using what's called the Marijuana Checkup to Go program. One of the biggest things we see, even among non-users, is people actually misperceive the frequency of marijuana and alcohol use among college kids. So they come to college thinking all the college kids do is drink and smoke. So universities have started using these checkup to go programs where they educate incoming freshmen about use rates of both marijuana and alcohol. The problem is that they're either voluntary, so your children have to find them and use them, or they're mandated after your child's been has gotten in trouble for being intoxicated on campus. But there's very little in between. Right? So most times where these programs are present is when you're first signing up for classes, and when you're signing up for orientation, and the university is collecting information from you. There'll be links, usually little boxes that say alcohol checkup or marijuana checkup, or are you curious about what alcohol use looks like or marijuana use looks like in college campuses. Like I said, the alcohol checkup to go is probably on closer to a couple thousand college campuses. The marijuana checkup to go program is prevalent on about 300 college campuses. So there are ways to get the information and to provide it to teenagers about what use looks like on college campuses. We see more dropouts among freshmen who initiate use because they're using in patterns that are more problematic for them, and so we try to educate them to offset that. And if the adolescent can make it through their freshman year and adjust their use accordingly, then what we see is in sophomore and junior and senior years, less frequency of experiencing problems from use. So again, education is important. The Good to Know campaign, I think, is really important, or a good resource. And these checkup to go programs. I have some cards at the front. When we end, if you want my card, I can give it to you and I can send you links. Also, you can find my email address on the CSU website if you go to the Department of Psychology. I'm happy to give you guys any of this information, and email is typically the best way to communicate with me. Other questions or comments? I think that and then together. So making sure you have discussions together, and by together I mean all together. Whoever you would consider to be part of the family should be involved in discussion. If you are co-parenting, then making sure that you agree before you engage in this conversation with your adolescents. If you disagree, then locking yourselves in a room where your adolescents can't hear you and fighting it out until you come to some agreement is important. You do not want to send mixed messages, and this is not just about marijuana. This will be about substance use of any kind, about sexual behavior of any kind. I am a big proponent of making sure that if you co-parent at any level, that the parents are on the same page. And this may involve compromise or changing your mind. Those are both good things, not bad things. But if you present different messages to your children, then you present confusing messages to your children. And so I really strongly recommend, if you're co-parenting, that you come to some agreement before you engage in these conversations. And that if once you've come to some agreement, you do it together. Don't rely on the other parent to have that conversation. If you're not comfortable having the conversation, then again, whether you're co-parenting or single parent, find ways you can practice the conversation before you have it with your teenager. Go out with your friends and role play the conversation. I know it sounds goofy, but if you get practice, you get better, and that applies to almost anything in life, right? So if you are uncomfortable talking about these topics with your teenager, then they are likely going to be uncomfortable talking with you about those topics as well. They're already going to be uncomfortable, but if you can present yourself in a way that you're not nervous and that you're comfortable and that you have a good sense that they're probably already doing some of these things, or that very soon they're going to start to do some of these things, that their friends are already doing these things, and you can have an open, honest conversation, they're going to be more comfortable talking to you over the long term about these things. Yeah?
If you've got younger kids,
Mm-hmm.
just based on median, when things start spiking, when is the good time?
For me, I don't think there's a bad time to start talking to your kids about any of these things. But usually I would recommend for parents to start thinking about having serious conversations with their children around the ages of 8 or 9, and then continuing to have those conversations as they get older. So conversations at 8 or 9 are basic questions about the biology of sex, where babies come from, about what drugs do. If you know there's a family history, you can start having those conversations then. There's clear evidence to suggest that in families where there's a history of addiction, that onset of substance use occurs at much younger ages, between the ages of 9 and 12. I'll say that again, 9 and 12. So if you start talking to your kids about how they're going to react differently to substances when they're 11, you're already 2 years too late. Not for everybody, but I just want you to keep that in mind. And that can vary, but a lot of it depends on access as well. So if you know you have a family history of substance use, you might want to make sure that you're not leaving substances around that your children get access to, because they might be more inclined to try those substances. But 8 or 9 would be when I'd start thinking about having these conversations, and then I'd say it's not a one-time conversation, it's an ongoing, continuing conversation. Other questions? Yeah.
What are those things that you're watching for change, in terms of change behavior in your adolescent to signal a real concern?
So for me, it would be anything beyond first use, or very moderate occasional use. But the The most significant indicators are the ones I've already mentioned. So if your adolescent's using by themselves, this would indicate that they likely would meet criteria for cannabis use disorder. If they're using in the mornings, if they're using on school nights, most of this is indicating problematic use because it's likely going to impact their ability to function in school the next day. If they're using more than their peers, right? So if your kid is the heavy user, then that's a problem. Go ahead.
I guess I was asking more about what are the indicators that something, that not that they're using, I'm saying.
So early identifiers, long before use.
What might I look for? You know, it used to be they joke about bloodshot eyes or something like that.
Yeah, and it's difficult to know what those indicators are. I would say the better thing to do is again, try to have an open, honest conversation with your children at an early enough age that they understand they can come and talk to you when they're engaging in the behaviors. You know, if starting to see things like lack of motivation, sleep pattern differences, and appetite differences, but those come in with adolescence no matter what, right? If I said if your kid starts getting moody, right, there we go, right? So that's one of the primary problems for any substance use among adolescents is that it's a turbulent time. There's a lot of things that are changing. And so those kinds of symptoms or signs are not always obvious. But if you start seeing significant changes, then you should be having some conversation about what's going on. And that, again, personality changes, sleep pattern changes, appetite pattern changes, any of those things might indicate that there's something going on that you want to be aware of. Other questions or comments? Yeah.
Can I just say something? For me, what I try to do is observe the normal behavior
Mhm.
and try not to be so reactive as to what they're doing, but rather an observation. Like I know she's had a bad day at school, but she just comes home and she goes up to her room versus when she sits down with me. So just kind of, I think just being, observant of that will clue you in when there's a greater change.
Sure.
That's a strategy.
Right.
That I would apply at home.
So for those of you that couldn't hear what was said in the back, those in the back that couldn't hear what was said in the front, observing typical patterns and getting a sense of what your teenager, how they normally act, and then not overreacting when they act slightly differently, but watching for larger shifts or larger pattern changes is probably a good idea. Sure. But at some rate, you're basically best to assume that your children are going to be engaging in some sort of substance use at some point. Just because the numbers suggest that the majority of adolescents are engaging in alcohol use, and just above the majority or near the majority are engaging in some sort of marijuana use. So I would say you don't necessarily need to see those signs if you just assume that they're going to be encountering these substances. Whether they're even using them, at the percentages that we're seeing, they're at least encountering them, and they're making decisions about whether they want to use or not use. Maybe on a daily basis, more likely on a weekly basis, they're probably facing a decision like that at some point. And if they know they can come and talk to you and get good information from you, they're probably going to feel more comfortable at making those decisions. That's what I'd say.